The crystal chandeliers of the Burlington Country Club sparkled like diamonds against tears as Isabella Morgan watched her entire world crumble before her eyes. At 32, she had believed she was living the American dream: successful interior design business, perfect marriage to Richard Thompson, one of Boston's most prestigious real estate developers, and a beautiful home in Beacon Hill that graced the covers of architectural magazines. But on that fateful spring evening, during what should have been a celebration of her company's 10th anniversary, Isabella's carefully crafted world shattered like fine china dropped on marble floors. "I'm so sorry, Isabella," whispered Sarah Matthews, her best friend since college, her voice trembling. "I couldn't keep this secret anymore. I found these documents in Richard's office last week." She slid a manila envelope across the table, her hands shaking as badly as her voice. Isabella's fingers felt numb as she opened the envelope. The first page was a bank statement, not from their joint account, but from a hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The second document was a series of real estate transfers, methodically moving assets away from their shared holdings. The third was the most devastating: divorce papers, already drafted, waiting to be filed. "He's been planning this for months," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been systematically moving your joint assets. The company's investments, the properties you designed, he's been transferring everything to shell companies under his name." The room began to spin as Isabella struggled to maintain her composure. Across the ballroom, she could see Richard charming a group of investors, his perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit and million-dollar smile masking the betrayal he had orchestrated. Next to him stood Victoria Pierce, her former assistant, wearing a dress that cost more than a month's salary, a salary Isabella had paid her until 3 months ago when Victoria suddenly resigned. "There's more," Sarah hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "Richard and Victoria, they've been..." Isabella raised her hand, stopping Sarah mid-sentence. Some truths were too painful to hear spoken aloud. The pieces were falling into place like a cruel puzzle: Victoria's late nights at the office, Richard's sudden business trips, the way they both seemed to disappear from events at the same time. The crystal champagne flute in Isabella's hand trembled as she watched Richard laugh at something Victoria had whispered in his ear. 7 years of marriage, 13 years of building her business, and a lifetime of dreams, all destroyed by the two people she had trusted most. "Mrs. Thompson?" A gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. James Carter, her company's young accountant, approached with concern etched on his face. "I've been trying to reach you all week. There are some irregularities in the company accounts that you need to see immediately." Isabella's heart, already breaking, somehow found a way to shatter even further. As James quietly explained the extent of the financial manipulation, she realized that Richard hadn't just betrayed their marriage, he had systematically dismantled everything she had built since graduating from design school. With trembling fingers, Isabella reached for her phone and dialed the one person who had always been her rock. "Dad," she whispered as soon as the line connected. "I need help." Robert Morgan's voice, strong and steady despite his 70 years, came through clear and determined. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, sweetheart. Don't confront him. Don't let him know you know anything. We're going to handle this the right way." As Isabella ended the call, she caught her reflection in one of the club's ornate mirrors. The woman staring back at her seemed both familiar and strange: designer dress, perfectly styled hair, makeup that couldn't quite hide the devastation in her eyes. But beneath the polished exterior, she felt something stirring, a strength she didn't know she possessed, a determination that burned through the pain. "James," she turned to her accountant, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I need you to pull every financial record we have. Every contract, every transaction, everything from the past 5 years." Sarah squeezed her hand. "What are you going to do?" Isabella took a deep breath, watching as Richard raised his glass in a toast, Victoria clinging to his arm like she belonged there. "I'm going to rebuild," she said quietly. "But first, I'm going to make sure they understand exactly what they've destroyed." As the evening's festivities continued around her, Isabella sat quietly, her mind already formulating plans. She thought of her grandmother, who had survived the Great Depression and built a small empire from a single sewing machine. She thought of her mother, who had raised 3 children alone after her first husband's death, before meeting and marrying Isabella's father. Strong women who had faced adversity with grace and emerged stronger. The night air was cool when Isabella finally stepped outside, waiting for her father's car to appear. Behind her, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses drifted through the club's open doors. Tomorrow, her world would explode. Tomorrow, the fight would begin. But tonight, under the vast New England sky, Isabella Morgan Thompson made a promise to herself: this betrayal would not define her. It would be the beginning of her greatest triumph. She just didn't know yet how many more betrayals, challenges, and unexpected allies awaited her on the path to redemption. Dawn hadn't yet broken over Boston when Isabella Morgan Thompson stepped into the offices of Wright & Associates, one of the city's most prestigious law firms. The marble lobby, usually quiet at 6:30 a.m., echoed with her determined footsteps. Margaret Wright, a formidable attorney in her 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen every type of corporate betrayal imaginable, was already waiting. "Your father called me last night," Margaret said, bypassing pleasantries as she ushered Isabella into her corner office overlooking the Charles River. "I've already had my team working through the night. What Richard and Victoria have done, it's not just unethical, Isabella. It's criminal." Isabella sat perfectly straight, her designer pseudo-armor against the vulnerability threatening to overwhelm her. "Show me everything." For the next 2 hours, Margaret laid out a devastating trail of evidence. Richard hadn't just been planning to leave her, he and Victoria had orchestrated a systematic dismantling of Isabella's business empire. Client contracts mysteriously redirected to a new design firm, coincidentally registered under Victoria's name. Property investments that Isabella had poured her heart into, transferred through a maze of shell companies. Even her personal trust fund, inherited from her grandmother, had been compromised. "The good news," Margaret said, sliding her reading glasses off, "is that they got sloppy. Arrogance makes people careless, and Richard's arrogance is legendary in Boston's business circles." A knock at the door interrupted them. James Carter entered, carrying several thick folders and looking like he hadn't slept. "Mrs. Thompson, I've found something else. The Riverside Heights project, the one Victoria was managing before she left? The contractors were billing us double the market rate. The excess was being funneled into an account in the Cayman Islands." Isabella's hands clenched in her lap. The Riverside Heights project had been her dream, a sustainable community development that would provide affordable housing while maintaining aesthetic excellence. She had fought for that project, convinced investors of its value, spent countless nights perfecting every detail. "There's more," James continued, his young face grim. "I traced the shell companies. Victoria didn't act alone. Lawrence Bennett was involved." The name hit Isabella like a physical blow. Lawrence Bennett was Richard's closest friend and their family attorney, the man who had handled her grandmother's estate, who had attended their Christmas dinners for years, who had helped Isabella set up her business structure when she first started. "Lawrence?" Her voice cracked slightly. "But he was the one who suggested I trademark my design concepts." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "The trademarks. James, pull those records immediately." As James rushed out, Isabella's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah: "Richard just arrived at the office. He's clearing out your personal files." Margaret was already reaching for her phone. "I'm calling Judge Harrison for an emergency injunction. Isabella, we need to move now. Are you ready?" Isabella stood, smoothing her skirt with steady hands. "I'd been ready since last night." The next few hours passed in a blur of legal documents, court filings, and phone calls. By noon, Richard Thompson found himself served with multiple court orders, freezing accounts, preventing asset transfers, and demanding immediate preservation of all documents. But Isabella's moment of triumph was short-lived. As she left Margaret's office, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Mom. Bella, her mother's voice was thick with tears. "I just got off the phone with Caroline Bennett. She's telling everyone that you've been embezzling from your own company. That Richard discovered it and was trying to protect the assets. They're saying..." "Mom, stop." Isabella's voice was firm. "We knew they would try something like this. Remember what Dad always says?" Her mother's laugh was watery but genuine. The bigger the lie, the more desperate the liar. As Isabella stepped out onto the bustling Boston street, a familiar black Tesla pulled up to the curb. Victoria Pierce stepped out, her perfect blonde hair catching the spring sunlight. "Isabella," Victoria's voice dripped with false concern. "We need to talk. Richard is willing to be generous if you handle this quietly." Isabella looked at her former assistant, remembering all the late nights they had worked together, all the confidences shared, all the trust betrayed. "You know, Victoria, my grandmother used to say something interesting about generosity. She said it's not about how much you give, but how much integrity you maintain while giving." Victoria's perfectly made-up face flickered with uncertainty. "I trusted you," Isabella continued, her voice carrying across the sidewalk. "I mentored you. When your mother was sick last year, I gave you 3 months paid leave. And this is how you repay that trust?" A small crowd of lunch-hour pedestrians had started to gather, drawn by the tension crackling between the two women. "You don't understand," Victoria hissed, her composure cracking. "Richard and I—" "Oh, I understand perfectly," Isabella cut her off. "What I don't think you understand is what's coming next." At that moment, Isabella's phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Thompson, this is David Chun from the Boston Globe. We've received some interesting information about irregularities at Thompson Development Corporation. Would you care to comment?" Victoria's face went pale as she saw the message preview on Isabella's phone screen. Without another word, she turned and fled back to her car. Isabella watched her go, then dialed Margaret's number. "It's starting. They're going to the press." "Good," Margaret replied. "Let them. Sometimes the best defense is letting your opponents think they're winning, right until the moment they realize they've lost everything." As Isabella headed toward her father's waiting car, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a store window. The woman looking back at her wasn't just a victim of betrayal anymore. She was a warrior preparing for battle, and this was just the beginning. Across town, in a private dining room at the exclusive St. James Club, Richard Thompson was about to discover that his carefully constructed house of cards was beginning to collapse. But what none of them knew, not Richard, not Victoria, not even Isabella herself, was that the biggest revelation was still to come, hidden in a safety deposit box that hadn't been opened since Isabella's grandmother passed away 15 years ago. The key to that box was in Isabella's purse, along with a letter her grandmother had left, marked with strict instructions, to be opened only in your darkest hour, when all seems lost. Inside, you'll find the truth about the Thompson family, and the real reason your path crossed with Richard's. Isabella's hand brushed against the envelope as she slid into her father's car. Not yet, she thought. First, she would show them exactly what she was capable of on her own. The safety deposit box key felt impossibly heavy in Isabella's hand as she stood in the cool, marble-lined vault room of First Boston National Bank. Her father, Robert Morgan, stood beside her, his usually jovial face serious. "Are you sure you want to do this now, sweetheart?" he asked softly. "Your grandmother was very specific about the timing." Isabella took a deep breath, remembering the events of the past 48 hours. The Boston Globe had published their story that morning, a seemingly damaging exposé suggesting financial misconduct at her company. But Margaret Wright had been ready, immediately releasing documented proof of Richard and Victoria's machinations. The public reaction had been swift and devastating, for them. "I'm sure, Dad," Isabella replied, sliding the key into the lock. "Grandmother always said timing was everything in both business and life. This is the moment she meant." The metal box slid out smoothly, decades of secrets waiting inside. On top lay an envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in her grandmother's elegant handwriting, "To Isabella Morgan Thompson, the truth about your heritage." Isabella's hands trembled as she opened the letter, her father's steady presence beside her providing silent support. "My dearest Isabella. Asterisk, if you're reading this, then the Thompson curse has finally reached you. I had hoped it wouldn't, that somehow you would be spared, but I've watched Richard Thompson court you with the same calculated precision his father used on other women of our family. Asterisk. What you don't know, what none of the younger generation knows, is that the Thompsons and the Morgans have a history that goes back 3 generations. Your great-grandfather, William Morgan, built the first Morgan department stores empire in the 1920s. His business partner? Charles Thompson, Richard's grandfather. Asterisk in 1929, just before the crash, Charles Thompson secretly sold his shares, then used that money to buy up the company's debts when the Depression hit. He forced William into bankruptcy, took over the entire empire, and rebranded it as Thompson Enterprises, the foundation of their current wealth. But Charles made one mistake. He didn't know about the proof William had gathered of his betrayal, proof I've protected all these years, waiting for the right moment. You'll find everything in the sealed documents within this box. My darling girl, I arranged your first meeting with Richard Thompson at that charity gala 5 years ago. Not because I wanted you to marry him, but because I knew someday he would show his true colors. The Thompsons destroy everything they touch, but their greatest weakness is their belief that they're untouchable. Use these documents wisely. And remember, revenge is a dish best served not just cold, but with impeccable timing. All my love. Grandmother Elizabeth. Isabella sat heavily in one of the vault room's chairs, her mind reeling. Dad? Did you know about this? Robert Morgan's face was a mix of guilt and determination. Only pieces. Your grandmother swore me to secrecy. She said you needed to find your own strength before you could handle the full truth. With shaking hands, Isabella opened the sealed envelope beneath her grandmother's letter. Inside were photographs, letters, and legal documents from the 1920s, irrefutable proof of Charles Thompson's betrayal. But more shocking were the recent documents, detailed records of similar patterns repeated by both Richard's father and Richard himself, destroying other families through seemingly legitimate business dealings. Mrs. Thompson? A bank employee appeared at the vault room door. There's an urgent call for you at the front desk. It's Mrs. Wright. Isabella quickly gathered the documents and hurried to take the call, her father following close behind. Margaret Wright's voice was tense with excitement. Isabella, we've found something huge. Those contractors from the Riverside Heights project? They've agreed to talk. And you won't believe who else has come forward, Claire Peterson. Isabella's breath caught. Claire Peterson had been Richard's executive assistant for 15 years before retiring suddenly 6 months ago. She knew everything about his business dealings. She says she has records, Margaret continued. Years of them. And Isabella, she claims Victoria isn't the first. This is apparently Richard's pattern. He finds successful women, marries them or gets close to them, then systematically destroys their businesses. There have been at least 3 others. The pieces clicked into place. Isabella thought of the strange warnings she'd received from Richard's ex-wife years ago, warnings she'd dismissed as bitterness. She thought of the other women she'd met at business functions who had seemed oddly wary of Richard despite his charm. Margaret, I need you to set up a meeting. Not just with Claire, with all of them. And... Isabella paused, looking at the documents from the safety deposit box. I think it's time we had a conversation about the true history of Thompson Enterprises. As Isabella and her father left the bank, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled up alongside them. The window rolled down to reveal Lawrence Bennett, looking considerably less polished than usual. Isabella, please, he said quickly. You don't understand what you're doing. There are bigger players involved. Richard isn't just protecting himself, he's protecting a legacy. A legacy of betrayal? Isabella's voice was ice cold. Tell me, Lawrence, did you help Richard's father the same way you helped him? Is destroying women's lives a billable service at your firm? Lawrence's face paled. You don't have proof of anything. Isabella held up the envelope from the safety deposit box. Would you like to bet your career on that? As Lawrence's SUV sped away, Isabella's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, you need to see this. Victoria just called a press conference for tomorrow morning. Another message followed immediately, this one from James Carter, found something in the old contract files. Richard's been using the same offshore bank since 2010. Just like his father did. And guess who else used that bank? Charles Thompson in 1929. Isabella looked at her father, a slow smile spreading across her face. Dad, I think it's time to make some calls. Starting with Judge Harrison. What are you thinking, sweetheart? I'm thinking it's time for a little history lesson. Victoria wants to give a press conference? Perfect. Let's give Boston's business community something they'll never forget. As they drove home through Boston's busy streets, Isabella's mind was already racing with plans. In her bag, her grandmother's letters and documents felt like a weapon more powerful than any legal filing. The Thompson empire had been built on betrayal, sustained by destruction. But they had never faced an enemy who understood their playbook from the inside. Tomorrow, Victoria would stand in front of the cameras, probably wearing another designer outfit bought with stolen money, and try to spin her lies. But this time, Isabella would be ready. Because now she understood, this wasn't just about her marriage, her business, or even her reputation. This was about generations of wrongs finally being made right. Her phone buzzed again, an email from Margaret Wright with a subject line that made her catch her breath, found Richard's father's private records. You won't believe who Victoria Pierce really is. Isabella clicked open the email, and as she read, her hand flew to her mouth. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and suddenly she understood why Victoria had seemed so familiar the first time they met. Some betrayals, it seemed, ran in the family. "Dad," she said quietly, "I think we need to move up our timeline. Tomorrow isn't just going to be about exposing Richard. It's going to be about exposing the entire Thompson legacy of lies." Robert Morgan looked at his daughter with pride. She had her grandmother's steel in her spine and her mother's fire in her eyes. "Whatever you need, sweetheart." The Morgan family has waited 3 generations for this moment. As the sun set over Boston Harbor, casting long shadows across the city's historic streets, Isabella Morgan Thompson prepared for the battle of her life. Tomorrow would change everything, not just for her, but for every woman the Thompsons had ever destroyed. And somewhere, she was sure, her grandmother was smiling. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza buzzed with anticipation. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like predatory eyes in the dim light. Victoria Pierce stood at the podium, the picture of wounded innocence in a conservative white suit that Isabella recognized from last season's Chanel collection. But Isabella wasn't watching the press conference on TV like Victoria and Richard expected. Instead, she stood in the shadows at the back of the ballroom, flanked by Margaret Wright and her father. Beside them stood 3 elegant women of varying ages, Richard's previous victims, each carrying thick folders of evidence. "Miss Pierce," a reporter called out, "you claim to have evidence of financial misconduct by Isabella Thompson?" Victoria's perfectly painted lips curved into a sympathetic frown. "It pains me deeply to be here today. Isabella was not just my employer, she was my mentor, someone I trusted and admired. But when I discovered irregularities in the company's accounts..." "Interesting choice of words," Isabella murmured to Margaret. "Shall we?" Margaret nodded, already typing on her phone. Seconds later, every reporter's phone in the room buzzed simultaneously with a massive email dump, documented proof of Victoria and Richard's schemes, along with the historical evidence from Isabella's grandmother. But Isabella wasn't done. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Perhaps, Victoria, you'd like to explain a different kind of irregularity? Like your real connection to the Thompson family?" Victoria's face went chalk white as Isabella emerged into the lights. The cameras swiveled, catching the moment perfectly. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," Isabella's voice carried clearly through the stunned silence. "I apologize for interrupting, but I believe Miss Pierce has forgotten some crucial details in her story. Would you like to tell them, Victoria, or should I?" Victoria's hands gripped the podium. "This is inappropriate." "Security." "Security won't help you," Margaret Wright stepped forward, holding up a court order. "This press conference has just become part of an ongoing federal investigation into corporate fraud." Isabella took the podium, gracefully maneuvering Victoria aside. "Let me tell you a story that begins in 1929, with a man named Charles Thompson and a betrayal that would echo through generations. Victoria, you might want to stay for this part. After all, it's your family history too." The cameras continued rolling as Isabella revealed the truth. Victoria Pierce was Charles Thompson's great-granddaughter through his secret second family, Richard's half-aunt, hidden from Boston society but positioned perfectly to help continue the family's tradition of corporate sabotage. The Thompson empire, Isabella continued, her voice steady, was built on destroying others. "Charles Thompson betrayed my great-grandfather. Richard's father continued the pattern. And now Richard and Victoria thought they would do the same to me. But they forgot one thing: my grandmother never threw anything away. On cue, Robert Morgan began distributing copies of the historical documents to the press. At the same time, the large screen behind the podium lit up with a presentation James had prepared, showing the identical patterns of fraud across 3 generations of the Thompson family. Victoria tried to flee but found her path blocked by Claire Peterson and the other women Richard had betrayed. Each had their own story, their own evidence, their own piece of the puzzle that now fit perfectly with Isabella's revelation. Mrs. Thompson, a veteran reporter from the Wall Street Journal, stood up. "Are you saying this goes beyond personal betrayal to systematic corporate fraud?" Indeed, Margaret Wright stepped in, every inch the powerful attorney. "We've filed RICO charges this morning. The pattern of fraud and corruption spans decades. And thanks to Ms. Pierce's ill-advised press conference, we can now add attempted defamation to the charges." The ballroom doors burst open as Richard Thompson strode in, his face contorted with rage. "This is absurd. These are baseless accusations." "Richard," Isabella's voice cut through his bluster, "I wouldn't say another word without your lawyer present." "Oh, wait." She glanced at Lawrence Bennett, who stood frozen in the doorway. "I don't think Lawrence will be representing anyone for a while. The Bar Association tends to frown on conspiracies to commit fraud." "You can't prove any of this," Richard snarled. Isabella smiled, the same smile her grandmother had worn in the photograph from 1929. "Check your phone, darling. The proof is already trending on Twitter. #ThompsonFraud is quite popular this morning." As if on cue, every phone in the room buzzed again. James Carter had timed the release of the offshore banking records perfectly. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable. Victoria suddenly lunged for Isabella, her composure completely shattered. "You stupid bitch. Do you know how long we planned this? How carefully we set everything up?" Security finally intervened, but not before every camera in the room captured Victoria's meltdown. Isabella remained perfectly calm, straightening her jacket with elegant disdain. "3 generations of Thompson men," she addressed the room, her voice clear and strong. 3 generations of destroying women they saw as threats to their power. But they forgot something crucial: those women had daughters, and granddaughters, and nieces. "We learned. We remembered. And we kept evidence." The next hour passed in a blur of questions, statements, and barely contained chaos. Federal agents arrived to escort Victoria and Richard out. Lawrence Bennett was seen leaving with his own set of agents. The story was breaking across every major news outlet. As the dust began to settle, Sarah appeared at Isabella's side with a cup of tea. "There's something else you should see," she whispered, holding out her tablet. On the screen was an email from Claire Peterson's archives, a decades-old correspondence between Richard's father and Victoria's mother, laying out the long-term plan to maintain the Thompson family's power by any means necessary. The final piece of the puzzle, proving that none of this had been accidental. "Mrs. Thompson," another reporter called out. "What happens now? To your company? To Thompson Enterprises?" Isabella took a moment before answering, thinking of her grandmother's letter. Now we rebuild. Not just my company, but everything the Thompsons tried to destroy. Their empire was built on lies and betrayal. We'll build something new on a foundation of truth and integrity." As the reporters began to disperse, Isabella felt a gentle touch on her arm. She turned to find an elderly woman in a wheelchair, Richard's first wife, Patricia, whom everyone had believed dead for 20 years. "Thank you," Patricia whispered. "I've been waiting so long for someone to expose the truth." Isabella knelt beside the wheelchair, taking the older woman's hand. "Would you like to tell your story now? There are people who need to hear it." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, I believe it's finally time." As Isabella stood to face the remaining reporters, she felt stronger than ever. The worst was over, but the real work was just beginning. The Thompson empire would fall, but from its ashes, something far more powerful would rise, a legacy of truth, justice, and redemption. Her phone buzzed one final time that morning, a message from an unknown number: "Your grandmother would be proud."
The Morgan women always win in the end.
The number was untraceable, but Isabella didn't need to know who sent it. Some mysteries were better left unsolved. The evening after the press conference, Isabella sat in her father's study in the historic Morgan family mansion on Beacon Street, watching as Patricia Thompson, Richard's supposedly dead first wife, sipped tea with trembling hands. The woman's silver hair caught the warm lamplight, and despite 20 years of hiding, traces of her former beauty remained. "They never expected me to keep records," Patricia said softly, placing her teacup on the antique side table. Richard's father, Alexander Thompson, he taught his son everything, including how to make troublesome women disappear. Isabella leaned forward. "But you didn't disappear, did you? You've been watching all this time." Patricia's thin lips curved into a smile that held decades of pain and determination. "From the shadows, yes. I had help. Your grandmother found me, you know. Right after they staged my accident." She knew exactly what the Thompsons were capable of because she'd been gathering evidence since 1929. "Mrs. Thompson," James Carter interrupted, appearing in the doorway. "I'm sorry, but you need to see this immediately." Isabella followed James to the mansion's home office, where multiple screens displayed breaking news coverage. Richard Thompson had called an emergency board meeting of Thompson Enterprises, and somehow, he'd managed to post bail. "That's impossible," Margaret Wright's voice came through the speakerphone. "Judge Harrison denied bail specifically because of flight risk." "Judge Harrison was found unconscious in his home an hour ago," James reported grimly. "Apparent heart attack, but nothing is apparent when it comes to the Thompsons," Isabella finished. She turned to Patricia. "How many judges do they have in their pocket?" More importantly, Patricia countered, "Who posted the bail?" Richard's assets were frozen. The answer came minutes later in the form of a sleek town car pulling up to the mansion. The security camera showed a woman in her 70s, elegant in a way that spoke of old money and older secrets. "Charlotte Blackwood, Richard's mother." "I should have known she'd surface," Patricia whispered. "Charlotte's worse than any of them. She's the one who orchestrated my death." Isabella straightened her spine, smoothing her silk blouse. "James, call Detective Morrison. I want police protection for Judge Harrison. Dad, get Patricia to the safe house. Margaret, can you join us here? I believe it's time to meet my former mother-in-law." Charlotte Blackwood swept into the study like a queen entering her court, her Hermes scarf artfully draped around her shoulders. "Isabella, darling. We need to talk. About how you tried to have Judge Harrison killed, or about how you helped fake Patricia's death 20 years ago?" Isabella remained seated behind her desk, forcing Charlotte to take the visitor's chair. The older woman's perfect composure flickered for just a moment. "Patricia? My dear, whatever are you talking about? Drop the act, Charlotte." Patricia stepped out from the adjacent room, her wheelchair making no sound on the thick carpet. "You really should have checked the brake lines on both cars that night." Charlotte's face went from porcelain pale to ashen. "This is impossible. You're dead." "No, Charlotte," Patricia's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "I'm just very, very patient. Like Elizabeth Morgan was patient. Like Isabella has been patient." Isabella opened her laptop, turning it to face Charlotte. On the screen was footage from a security camera dated 20 years ago, showing Charlotte and Alexander Thompson discussing Patricia's accident in explicit detail. "Your grandson Danny's quite good with computers," Isabella commented. "Once I explained what his family had done, he was happy to hack into the old security archives. Amazing what people forget to erase." Charlotte's composure cracked entirely. "You involved my grandson? Danny is innocent." "Yes, he is," Isabella agreed. "And he deserves to know the truth about his heritage. About how his fortune was built on destroying others. He made that choice himself." "What do you want?" Charlotte's voice was barely a whisper. "The truth," Isabella stated simply. "All of it. Starting with why you helped Richard target me specifically. And don't pretend it was a coincidence, I found the files. You've been watching me since I was in college." Charlotte's laugh was hollow. "Because you were supposed to be mine. Did Elizabeth never tell you?" Before Charles Thompson betrayed William Morgan, he and I were engaged.
But I chose power over love, married Alexander Thompson instead.
When I saw you, William's great-granddaughter, succeeding on your own, everything I'd sacrificed felt meaningless.
You had to be destroyed.
The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Isabella thought of all the casual encounters over the years that hadn't been casual at all: Charlotte at charity events, at gallery openings, always watching, always planning.
So you groomed your own son to be a weapon, Patricia interjected. Taught him to charm and destroy powerful women. Made him marry me because my family's shipping company was a threat.
Then had me eliminated when I discovered the truth. And when that wasn't enough, Isabella continued, you brought in Victoria, the illegitimate Thompson heir, to help destroy me too.
All because I reminded you of your own choices?
Charlotte stood abruptly. You have no idea what it was like, being a woman in that world, in that time.
Power was the only protection.
No, Isabella's voice was firm. You had a choice. Every time you helped destroy another woman, you had a choice.
And now you have one last choice to make.
She slid a document across the desk. A full confession, detailing everything, from Charles Thompson's original betrayal to Judge Harrison's heart attack tonight.
Sign it, and Danny keeps his trust fund.
Refuse, and I release everything, including proof that you embezzled from your own grandson's inheritance. Charlotte's hand shook as she reached for the pen.
You're more like me than you know, Isabella.
No, Isabella stood, her grandmother's strength flowing through her. I'm what you could have been, Charlotte, if you'd chosen integrity over power. The difference is, I'm going to use my power to protect others, not destroy them. As Charlotte signed the confession, Isabella's phone buzzed.
A text from Sarah, Richard's board meeting is starting. He's trying to liquidate the company assets. Right on schedule, Isabella smiled. Margaret? Margaret Wright stepped into the room, accompanied by SEC agents.
Charlotte Blackwood, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted murder, and corporate espionage.
Richard's little board meeting is being raided as we speak.
You were ready for all of this, Charlotte said, almost admiringly, as agents stepped forward with handcuffs. I learned from the best, Isabella replied.
My grandmother taught me to always be 3 steps ahead.
The only difference is, I'm using that lesson to build something, not tear it down. As Charlotte was led away, Patricia wheeled closer to Isabella.
It's not over, you know.
There are more secrets, more layers. I know, Isabella picked up a framed photo from her desk, her grandmother on her wedding day, young and beautiful, with a mysterious smile. But for the first time in 3 generations, we're the ones holding all the cards. Outside, reporters were already gathering, drawn by the sight of police cars in front of the Morgan mansion.
But Isabella wasn't worried about headlines anymore. The real story was still unfolding, a story of redemption, justice, and the power of women who refused to be broken. Her phone buzzed again, Danny Thompson asking to meet.
The youngest Thompson heir had chosen his side, and with him came a new generation's chance at redemption. But first, there was one more secret to uncover, hidden in the last unopened envelope from her grandmother's safety deposit box.
Ready for the next round? Patricia asked, seeing Isabella eye the envelope.
More than ready, Isabella replied.
It's time to rebuild everything they tried to destroy, starting with the truth.
The envelope waited on her desk, her grandmother's elegant handwriting promising one final revelation that would change everything they thought they knew about the Thompson-Morgan feud.
But that would have to wait until morning.
Tonight, justice had finally begun to prevail, and somewhere, Elizabeth Morgan was smiling.
Dawn was breaking over Boston Harbor as Isabella finally opened the last envelope from her grandmother's safety deposit box.
Danny Thompson sat across from her in the Morgan mansion's library, his young face bearing little resemblance to his grandfather's ruthless features. At 25, he represented hope for breaking the Thompson cycle of destruction. Whatever's in there, Danny said quietly, I want you to know I'm committed to making things right.
Isabella nodded, carefully breaking the seal on the envelope. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten letter.
The photograph showed 2 couples at what appeared to be a summer party in the 1920s, her great-grandfather William Morgan and his wife standing with Charles Thompson and a striking young Charlotte. The letter began with words that made Isabella's heart stop.
my dearest Isabella.
Asterisk, if you're reading this, you've already uncovered most of the truth about the Thompsons. But there's one secret that even Charlotte doesn't know, one that changes everything. Asterisk. Asterisk, the night Charles Thompson betrayed William Morgan, he didn't just steal the company.
He stole something far more precious, proof that the original Thompson fortune came from bootlegging during Prohibition. William had discovered Charles's father's criminal empire and was planning to go to the authorities. Asterisk.
Asterisk, but here's what Charles never knew. William Morgan had already turned the evidence over to a young federal agent named James Carter. Yes, your trusted accountant James's grandfather.
The Carter family has been protecting our interests for 3 generations, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. Asterisk. Asterisk, the Thompson empire wasn't just built on betrayal, it was built on blood money.
Every legitimate business they acquired, including our family's company, was purchased with profits from organized crime. Asterisk.
Isabella looked up at Danny, whose face had gone pale. Did you know any of this?
I had suspicions, he admitted. There were always rumors about great-great-grandfather Thompson's real business.
But proof?
Mrs. Thompson, James Carter appeared in the doorway, his usual calm demeanor excited.
You need to see this immediately. In the Home Office, multiple screens showed breaking news.
The FBI had just raided a series of safety deposit boxes registered to shell companies linked to Thompson Enterprises. Inside, they'd found ledgers dating back to the 1920s, proving every word of Elizabeth Morgan's letter.
The timing, Isabella breathed. Grandmother, you brilliant woman.
You knew they'd try to access those boxes once we started exposing them.
Her phone rang. Margaret Wright. Isabella, it's bigger than we thought. The FBI's Organized Crime Division has been building a case against old Thompson Holdings for years.
Your grandmother's evidence was the missing piece they needed.
Where's Richard now? Isabella asked.
In custody, along with Charlotte and Victoria.
But there's something else. We found recordings, Charlotte's private conversations with Richard over the years.
She wasn't just his mother, she was the mastermind behind everything. She's been running the criminal enterprises all along, using the legitimate businesses as cover.
Danny slumped in his chair. My whole life, everything I thought I knew.
Isabella reached across the desk to squeeze his hand.
You're not your family, Danny. You proved that when you chose to help us.
Mrs. Thompson, one of the security guards, interrupted.
There's someone at the gate, says she's Victoria Pierce's daughter? Isabella and Danny exchanged shocked looks. Victoria has a daughter?
The security cameras showed a young woman, maybe 20 years old, with Victoria's blonde hair but none of her calculating expression. She looked scared and determined all at once.
Let her in, Isabella decided.
But call Detective Morrison first. 10 minutes later, Emily Pierce sat in the library, clutching a worn leather journal.
My mother, she never wanted me to know about any of this.
I was raised by my grandmother in Colorado.
But when I saw the news,
she placed the journal on the desk. This was my grandmother's, Victoria's mother's. It explains everything about the Thompson family, about why my mother agreed to help them. They threatened to expose that she was Charles Thompson's illegitimate granddaughter unless she helped destroy you.
Blackmail, Danny murmured.
They blackmailed their own family member.
Emily nodded tearfully.
My grandmother wrote that Charlotte was the one who suggested using my mother this way. Said it was fitting, using the family shame to protect the family power.
Isabella read through the journal, each page revealing new layers of manipulation and cruelty.
But there was something else too, a pattern of resistance, of women who had tried to break free from the Thompson influence over the years.
Emily, she said gently, would you be willing to make a statement to the FBI? Your mother might receive leniency if we can prove she was coerced.
The young woman straightened her spine, showing a flash of steel that reminded Isabella of herself.
Yes. I want to help end this, all of it.
James Carter, who had been quietly working at his computer, suddenly made a startled sound.
Mrs. Thompson. I found something in the old Morgan Company records. A trust fund, set up by William Morgan before the Thompson betrayal.
It was hidden so well that even Charles never found it. According to these calculations, with compound interest.
He turned his screen around, showing a figure that made everyone in the room gasp. "That would be enough to rebuild everything," Danny whispered. "To restore both families' legacies the right way." Isabella sat back, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. Sometimes justice takes generations, but it always comes due. Her phone buzzed, a message from Patricia, "Turn on the news. Charlotte's asking to make a deal." On the screens, Charlotte Blackwood was being led into the federal courthouse, her designer suit replaced by prison orange. Gone was the aristocratic bearing, replaced by the desperate look of someone who had finally run out of schemes. "Danny," Isabella turned to the young Thompson heir. "What do you say we use that trust fund to create something new? A foundation dedicated to helping women rebuild after corporate sabotage and fraud?" Danny's eyes lit up. "The Morgan Thompson Foundation for Business Ethics? A way to heal the past and protect the future?" Emily leaned forward. "I want to help too. Maybe this is how we break the cycle. All of us together." Isabella looked at the three young people in her office, Danny Thompson, Emily Pierce, and James Carter Jr., each representing a different thread in this complex tapestry of betrayal and redemption. "I think this is exactly what my grandmother hoped for. Not just justice, but healing." Her phone buzzed again, Sarah, with news that the Boston Globe wanted an exclusive interview about the new foundation. But there was something else too. Patricia had found more evidence in her years of hiding, documentation of other families the Thompsons had destroyed. "One step at a time," Isabella murmured, picking up her grandmother's photograph. "First, we rebuild. Then, we help others do the same." Outside, the morning sun had fully risen, painting Boston's skyline in shades of gold. In the distance, the Thompson Enterprises building stood as a monument to generations of corruption. But not for much longer. Soon it would bear a new name, serve a new purpose. Emily's voice broke the silence. "My grandmother wrote something else in her journal. She said the real Thompson curse wasn't their cruelty, it was their fear. Fear of strong women, fear of losing power, fear of the truth." Well, Isabella smiled, thinking of all the women who had fought this battle across generations. They certainly had reason to be afraid. They just never understood that true power comes from building others up, not tearing them down. As if in response, her grandmother's last letter seemed to whisper from the desk, "Remember, my darling girl, a legacy built on lies will always fall. But a legacy built on truth and justice? That's unshakable." 1 month after Charlotte Blackwood's arrest, Isabella stood at the podium in the same Fairmont Copley Plaza ballroom where Victoria had tried to destroy her. But today, the room was transformed. Gone were the harsh news cameras and hostile reporters. Instead, the space was filled with survivors, supporters, and symbols of hope. The Morgan Thompson Foundation for Business Ethics isn't just about making amends, Isabella addressed the crowded room. It's about creating a shield for future generations. Every woman who has faced corporate sabotage, every entrepreneur who has been betrayed, every dreamer who has been told they don't belong, this is for you. In the front row, Danny Thompson sat beside Emily Pierce, both of them having spent the past month working tirelessly to transform their family's legacy. Behind them, Patricia Thompson's presence in her wheelchair served as a living testimony to survival and resilience. But before we move forward, Isabella continued, we need to acknowledge those who fought this battle in silence. Thanks to the evidence Patricia gathered during her years in hiding, we've identified 37 families who were systematically destroyed by Thompson Enterprises over the past 50 years. A screen behind her displayed photographs, faces of women who had lost everything, their stories finally being told. Today, we're announcing a $500 million restoration fund. But more importantly, we're creating a network of support, mentorship, and legal protection. Margaret Wright stepped forward, her legal pad filled with notes. The first case has already been filed. Sarah Chen lost her tech company to Thompson subsidiaries in 2015. Today, we're not just restoring her assets, we're helping her launch a new venture, backed by the foundation. Sarah Chen rose from her seat, tears streaming down her face as the room erupted in applause. She was just the first of many. But even as Isabella orchestrated this moment of triumph, she knew the battle wasn't completely over.
That morning, she had received an encrypted email from one of James Carter's cybersecurity contacts. Someone had been trying to access the old Thompson Enterprises servers, someone using Charlotte Blackwood's old passwords. "Mrs. Thompson," James whispered urgently, approaching the podium.
"We found something. The server access, it wasn't random. They were looking for something specific. A file called Project Legacy." Isabella's pulse quickened. She had seen that name before, in her grandmother's papers.
"The presentation can wait," she murmured.
"Get Danny and Emily. Meeting in my office in 20 minutes.
As the foundation launch continued under Margaret's capable guidance, Isabella led her small team to the secure office she'd established in the renovated Morgan building. The space still smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings.
"Project Legacy," she announced, spreading out her grandmother's papers. Charlotte mentioned it during her interrogation, but the FBI couldn't find any documentation.
"Now we know why. It wasn't in the Thompson records.
It was in ours." Danny leaned forward, his face tense. "What exactly are we looking at?"
"A contingency plan," Isabella explained. "Your grandmother wasn't just running criminal enterprises through legitimate businesses. She was building a failsafe, a way to destroy evidence and transfer assets if the empire ever fell. And according to these notes, she hid the trigger in the last place anyone would look."
"The Morgan family records," Emily breathed. "Because everyone would be focused on the Thompson side." James Carter's fingers flew across his keyboard. "The server attacks, they're coming from a location in Switzerland. A private bank."
"Where Charlotte stored her personal fortune," Danny added grimly. "The money that posted her bail before we stopped it." Isabella's phone buzzed, a text from Detective Morrison, "Charlotte's requesting a meeting.
Says she has information about imminent threats to your foundation." "It's a trap," Emily said immediately. "She's trying to manipulate you again."
But Isabella was already reaching for her coat.
"Of course it is.
But this time, we're going to beat her at her own game."
"Danny, call Judge Harrison, the real one, not whoever they tried to bribe." "Emily, contact the FBI." "James, keep tracking those server attacks."
"It's time to spring Charlotte's trap before she can spring ours." The drive to the federal detention center where Charlotte was being held gave Isabella time to think. Her grandmother's last letter had hinted at something bigger than just corporate fraud, a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Boston society. Charlotte Blackwood sat in the visitor's room looking somehow elegant despite her prison jumpsuit. Her silver hair was perfectly arranged, her posture still regal. But her eyes held a desperation that hadn't been there before. "I wondered how long it would take you to find Project Legacy," Charlotte said without preamble.
"I supposed I trained you too well, in a way." "Trained me?"
Isabella's voice was ice.
"You tried to destroy me."
"I made you stronger," Charlotte countered. "Everything, Richard, Victoria, all of it, was a test.
And you passed.
You proved yourself worthy of the real Thompson legacy."
Isabella felt a chill despite the room's warmth. "What are you talking about?"
Charlotte leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper.
"Why do you think I chose you specifically? Why do you think I spent years watching you, shaping events around you? Project Legacy isn't just about money or power. It's about bloodlines. About the real secret Charles Thompson took to his grave. Which is that the Morgan and Thompson lines were never meant to be enemies. We were meant to be allies. The original betrayal, it wasn't about money. It was about protecting something bigger.
Something that both our families were sworn to guard."
Isabella's mind raced, connecting dots she hadn't seen before.
The strange symbols in her grandmother's papers. The coded references in Charlotte's personal files. The mysterious trust fund that seemed too perfectly hidden. The foundation, she realized suddenly.
You're not trying to destroy it.
You're trying to ensure it succeeds, but on your terms. Charlotte's smile was a ghost of her former confidence.
Finally, you understand.
But there are others, powerful people who don't want the truth to come out. People who benefited from keeping our families divided.
And they're moving against us even now.
As if on cue, Isabella's phone buzzed with an urgent message from James. The server attacks, they're not trying to access files.
They're trying to plant evidence. Someone's setting up both families to take a fall.
Charlotte's eyes gleamed with something like respect.
Now you see the real game. The question is, are you ready to play it? Are you ready to learn what Project Legacy really means?
Isabella stood, her grandmother's strength flowing through her veins.
No, Charlotte. I'm not going to play your game. I'm going to end it, all of it. The truth isn't a weapon to be wielded. It's a light to be shared.
She turned to leave, then paused. But thank you for confirming what I suspected. Project Legacy isn't in the Morgan records or the Thompson files. It's in the one place nobody thought to look, the sealed records of the federal agent who helped my great-grandfather escape in 1929.
James Carter's grandfather didn't just hide evidence. He hid the truth about both our families.
The flash of shock on Charlotte's face was all the confirmation Isabella needed. As she left the detention center, her phone buzzed again. Danny had found something in his grandfather's personal safe. Something that would change everything they thought they knew about the Thompson-Morgan feud.
But that revelation would have to wait. First, they had a foundation to protect and a legacy to rebuild, the right way this time. The document Danny had found in his grandfather's safe changed everything.
As Isabella held the yellowed pages in the Morgan Mansion's library, surrounded by Danny, Emily, Patricia, James, and Sarah, she finally understood the true magnitude of what her grandmother had orchestrated.
It's a covenant, Danny explained, his voice hushed with awe. Signed in 1901 by both our great-great-grandfathers.
The Thompson and Morgan families weren't just business partners, they were guardians. The document detailed a sacred trust. Both families had been entrusted with protecting and supporting women entrepreneurs during a time when they had no legal right to own businesses. The original Morgan-Thompson partnership had been created as a shield, using their male-owned companies to secretly help women build and maintain their own enterprises. But Charles Thompson betrayed that trust, Patricia added, wheeling closer to examine the document.
He didn't just steal the company, he perverted the entire purpose of the covenant. Instead of protecting women in business, he began destroying them. And my grandmother knew, Isabella breathed. That's why she spent decades gathering evidence.
She wasn't just seeking revenge, she was trying to restore the original purpose of the covenant.
James Carter cleared his throat. There's more. I finished decoding the Project Legacy files.
Charlotte didn't create it, your grandmother did, Mrs. Thompson. She planted it in the Thompson servers decades ago, knowing they'd eventually discover it and think it was their own failsafe. Isabella smiled, remembering her grandmother's clever eyes. Of course. She knew they'd try to access it when everything started falling apart. She wanted them to lead us to this covenant. Her phone buzzed. Detective Morrison, Charlotte Blackwood is ready to make a full confession.
But she's asking for you first.
When Isabella arrived at the federal detention center this time, Charlotte looked different. The aristocratic armor had cracked completely, revealing something almost human underneath.
You won the game before it even began, Charlotte said quietly.
Elizabeth Morgan played us all perfectly. She knew I'd choose power over love, knew I'd corrupt Richard, knew exactly how it would all fall apart.
Why are you telling me this now?
Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, real ones, for perhaps the first time in decades.
Because I finally read the whole covenant.
We were supposed to protect them, Isabella. All those women we destroyed, we were supposed to be their guardians.
The guilt
is why you're going to make this right, Isabella finished firmly.
Starting with a full confession, not just about the corporate fraud, but about the women you destroyed. All of them.
Back at the Morgan Mansion that evening, Isabella gathered everyone in the grand dining room. The table was spread with documents, the covenant, Charlotte's confession, evidence from Patricia's years in hiding, and most importantly, plans for the future.
The Morgan Thompson Foundation for Business Ethics needs to be more than just restoration, Isabella announced. We're going to fulfill the original covenant.
Danny, Emily, and I will establish a network of protection and support for women in business.
But this time, we'll do it openly, proudly. And the Thompson Empire? James asked. Will be dismantled, Danny answered firmly.
Every illegal asset will be liquidated, with the proceeds going to the foundation.
The legitimate businesses will be restructured under ethical leadership.
Emily stood, her face shining with purpose.
I've been going through my mother's records.
Victoria didn't just help destroy businesses, she kept detailed files on everyone involved. We can use that information to identify and help more victims.
Patricia wheeled to the head of the table. And I'll serve as living testimony.
My story, combined with the evidence I gathered, we can prevent this from ever happening again.
Sarah, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. The press is already calling it the biggest corporate ethics reform in Boston history. But it's more than that, it's a revolution in how we protect and empower women in business. Isabella walked to the window, looking out over the Boston skyline.
In the distance, she could see the Thompson Enterprises building, soon to be renamed the Morgan Thompson Foundation Center for Business Ethics. My grandmother once told me that true power isn't about what you can take from others, she said softly.
It's about what you can build together.
Her phone buzzed one last time. Judge Harrison.
The court had approved their comprehensive settlement plan. The Thompson criminal enterprises would be fully dissolved, their legitimate assets restructured under the foundation's oversight.
Richard, Victoria, and Charlotte would face justice, but with provisions for rehabilitation and restitution. Mrs. Thompson, James called from his laptop.
The first applications for foundation support are coming in.
Over 1,000 women seeking help to rebuild their businesses. Isabella turned back to the room. To these people who had become more than allies, they were the architects of a new legacy.
Then let's begin, she smiled. We have promises to keep, not just to my grandmother or to the covenant,
but to every woman who's ever faced betrayal and refused to be broken. Danny raised his glass of water. Alcohol had been banned from Thompson Morgan meetings, a symbol of breaking from the old ways.
To legacy. To legacy, they all echoed. Later that night, alone in her grandmother's study, Isabella opened the final page of Elizabeth Morgan's diary.
My dearest girl. By now you understand that everything, every betrayal, every loss, every triumph, was part of a greater purpose.
The covenant our ancestors signed wasn't just about business.
It was about recognizing that true power lies in lifting others up, not tearing them down.
You've done more than restore our family's legacy.
You've created something entirely new, a foundation built on truth, justice, and the unshakable strength of women supporting women.
The path ahead won't be easy.
There will always be those who choose power over principle, greed over grace. But you've proven that integrity, compassion, and determination can overcome even the darkest betrayals.
Remember always, a legacy isn't what's left behind when we're gone.
It's what grows in the hearts of those we've touched while we're here.
With all my love and pride. Grandmother Elizabeth.
Isabella closed the diary, feeling the weight of generations, not as a burden now, but as a foundation for the future. Outside her window, Boston's lights twinkled like stars, each one perhaps representing a dream waiting to be rebuilt, a woman waiting to rise.
She had lost everything to betrayal, yes.
But from that loss, she had built something far greater than herself, a legacy of hope, a covenant renewed, and a promise that no woman would ever have to face such battles alone again. And somewhere, she knew, her grandmother was smiling.